Hey, good morning, everybody. Hope you've had a great 4th of July holiday. So glad that you carved out the time to be here this weekend. We are going to talk today about how to respond to those people in our lives who make our lives difficult. We're continuing today this series called Jesus On, and during this series, we've been talking about what Jesus has to say on some of the most important issues in our lives. And we've been making our way through a section of the Bible that we know today as the Sermon on the Mount, the longest teaching of Jesus recorded anywhere in the Bible and his most famous teaching. So glad you're here again this week. Big shout out to those of you who are joining us online, watching the live stream right now. I would encourage you to take out a sheet of paper, take some notes, and I would encourage you also, if you live within a 20-minute drive, to join us in person next week or at some point this summer. We'd love to meet you. But today we're talking about what I think is one of the most challenging commands that you can find anywhere in the Bible. It's when Jesus said this. He said, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Now that's not confusing. It's pretty clear. It's pretty straightforward. But let me tell you, it's difficult. Because this goes against everything that our culture tells us to do, and it goes against oftentimes everything that our heart is telling us to do. When somebody hurts us, when somebody wounds us, we don't want to love them. We want to hate them. And we want to allow that hate to settle into our hearts and just kind of stand back and wait for them to get what is coming to them. It's kind of like the old story of the truck driver who stopped in a roadside diner to get something to eat. And while he was seated there at the counter eating his meal, these three rough-looking, big, burly guys on motorcycles pulled into the parking lot. And they parked their bikes and went inside, and they saw this guy all by himself at the counter, thought they'd have a little fun with him. So one guy goes over and just takes the sandwich off his plate, takes a bite out of it, and puts it back. A second guy goes over and drinks out of his coffee cup. The third guy takes the sugar container and just dumps sugar on this guy's food. And this truck driver, he didn't respond. He just quietly got up, paid his bill, and walked out. And of course, the three guys on the motorcycles, they were kind of disappointed that they couldn't provoke a fight with this guy. And one of them turned to the waitress and said, "Guess he's not much of a man, is he?" She said, "I guess not." And she looked out the window and she said, "I guess he's not much of a truck driver either. He just backed over three motorcycles out there in the parking lot," right? And that's what we all want, right? That's what comes naturally to us, to want to get even, to settle the score. But as followers of Christ, we are called to a very different kind of life. Jesus said, "You're the salt of the earth. You are here to hold back the decay in a decaying world. You are the light of the world," he said. "You're here to shine in the darkness of a world that's increasingly dark." And if we're going to be salt and light in this world that's dark and decaying, then we have to live differently. And one of the ways in which we have to live differently is in how we respond to the people in our lives who attempt to make our lives difficult. So today, I want to focus on just 5 verses from Matthew chapter 5. If you have a Bible app on your phone, you can go ahead and open that up and find this passage, or open up a Bible. If you're watching online, bring up a Bible app. Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 47. If I could summarize everything that Jesus was saying in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, if I could boil it down to one sentence, it would be this: when someone does something to you that you don't deserve, do something for them that they don't deserve. Now that is a radical idea. And before you tune me out and before you begin to mentally push back and say, yeah, but, just listen and allow God to speak into your heart today through the Word of God. Now, I want to frame this message around 3 questions. And the first question is this one: who is my enemy? It's a question I'd like you to answer. And maybe you don't have an enemy right now in the strongest sense of the word, but we all have people in our lives from time to time who tend to make our lives more difficult. We all have people in our lives from time to time who are tough to love. And I think we have to begin with this question because I don't want today's message to just be theoretical. I want it to be practical. I want it to be very personal. So bring to mind right now the person, or maybe a couple of people, that are the closest thing in your life to an enemy. Who is that person that you have a hard time loving, or those people that you have a hard time loving? It might be that person who is circulating destructive rumors about you. If you're a student, it might be that student in high school or middle school who seems to have made it their mission in life to make your life miserable. It might be somebody that you're close to. Might be a friend or a family member that you love, but right now you're in the middle of a conflict and they feel like your enemy. Maybe it's a former spouse that you're battling with over child custody or financial matters. Maybe the person who's the enemy in your life right now is someone who has an opposing political viewpoint. And you've gone from hating their politics to hating them as a person because now we live in this outrage culture where we hate people that we don't even know all that well. Maybe it's as simple as this. Maybe the enemy in your life right now is that obnoxious neighbor who throws parties late into the night and keeps you awake. Like, who is the person in your life right now that you have a hardest time loving, the person who seems to be making your life difficult? Just bring that person to mind, a name or a face, as we continue. Now, that's the first question, and that's probably the easiest question. But the second question is this: how should I respond to my enemies? And Jesus here tells us to do something that is so counterintuitive and so countercultural, but so like the heart of God. And here's how it begins, verse 43. He says, "You have heard that it was said." Now notice that. And not this is what God said or this is what the law says. You have heard that it was said. In other words, this is the conventional wisdom. This is the word on the street. This is what you've always been taught. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now let me explain what's going on here, because 6 times within the Sermon on the Mount, within this message, this phrase comes up. You have heard that it was said. And here's what Jesus was doing. He was seeking to correct some things that had been distorted throughout the years. See, hundreds of years before Jesus came on the scene, God had given to his people laws and principles by which they were called to live. And if they would live by these laws and these principles, they would experience peace and joy, and God's favor would be upon them. But over the centuries, these laws and these principles had become distorted over time. The people of Israel, and especially the religious leaders, had begun to dilute them and redefine them and make them a little bit more manageable, a little bit more doable. And this really is an example of that. In fact, let me take you back all the way to the book of Leviticus, actually chapter 12, verse 19, I think it is. But it says here, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." So this was a command that was given to God's people in the infancy of their existence. Very clear, very straightforward. But what happened over a period of time is that this very clear, straightforward commandment was corrupted. The religious leaders especially, they began to focus on the word neighbor. And they began to study that and debate that. And they would say, well, yeah, it says I've got to love my neighbor as myself, but who exactly is my neighbor? Who counts? Who's in that category? Who exactly do I have to love in this way? And they began to narrow the definition of that word to the point where it included a very, very small group of people. And they said, well, certainly God wouldn't include people of a different race, outsiders. He wouldn't want us to love Gentiles, even though God did. And they said, well, certainly God wouldn't want us to love even some of our own people, like tax collectors and notorious sinners. And eventually, over time, they whittled down the meaning of the word neighbor to the point where it was a very select group of people like them, people who were easy to love, the good people, the people who were put together. In fact, Jesus told one of his most famous parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan, in response to the question, well, who then is my neighbor? And Jesus tells this story and essentially says, your neighbor is anyone that you encounter who has a need. So they had narrowed the meaning of this word to the point where it didn't include all that many people. And then they did this. Go back to verse 43. Look at the last 4 words. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, if you were to study the Old Testament, if you were to study the Jewish law, do you know where you first find that commandment? Nowhere. It just kind of over the years got added in there. It just got tacked on. And so the conventional understanding was, well, I'm going to love the people that are easy to love, but the people that are not easy to love and the people who are my enemies, I'm going to hate them. So they had taken this very clear commandment and they had changed the meaning of it to the point where it wasn't all that hard to keep it. It kind of reminds me of a cartoon. Back in the 60s, there was this comic strip called Father Juniper. It didn't last very long. But there was this one, and the caption under it said this: it's easy. First you shoot the arrow, and then you just take the paintbrush and Because it's a whole lot easier to shoot the arrow and then make the target, right? And I think sometimes we do the same thing with God's standards. It's a whole lot easier to adjust the standard to something that doesn't require a lot of effort and makes us look good than to actually try to meet the standard that God has called us to. And that was happening in Jesus' day. God's law, his beautiful set of principles for his people, had been reduced to something that was easy to keep and made them look good. And so Jesus kind of shakes them out of their complacency. He goes on to say this, "You've heard it that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, this is what you need to do if you're really going to be one of my followers. This is what you're going to do if you want to really reflect the heart of God. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Now, there would have been an audible gasp in the crowd at this point. And Jesus was telling us to do two things. Number one, he says, I want you to love your enemies. What does that mean exactly? Well, I think if we want to understand what that means, we got to begin with understanding what the word love meant to them. Because here's the challenge. In our language today, in the English language, we have one word for love. It's the word love. And we use it to fit all kinds of situations. And I mean all kinds of different things. Like you can say, I love my dog. Or, I love summer. I love chocolate. Hey, I love your dress. I love my wife. I love my kids. And we use this one word to cover all kinds of different meanings. They're not the same thing. Hopefully, you love your wife more than you love chocolate, right? I won't ask for a raise of hands on that, but they mean very different things. But see, the New Testament originally was written in the Greek language, and the Greeks, they were smart. They had actually 4 different words for love that meant very different things. So there was, first of all, the word storge. That was the Greek word for the love of a family. Most specifically, it was applied to the love between a parent and a child, that unique bond. Then there was the Greek word phileo. The word phileo literally means the love of a close friend, the love that you have for your band of brothers, for your posse, for your closest friends. And by the way, Philadelphia gets its name from this Greek word because the word Philadelphia means city of brotherly love. And if you've ever driven in Philadelphia, you know they need to change the name of the city. So there was storge, love of family. Phileo, the love of a close friend. There was eros, the love of emotion, passion, or physical attraction. And this is what we mean when we say he fell in love, she is lovesick. To make love, all of those are this kind of love, eros. It's probably the most common use of the word in our language today. Now, all of these different forms of love, they are beautiful gifts from God meant to be enjoyed and experienced. But there's a fourth kind of love, and it was the Greek word agape. This was a different kind of love. This was a word that was not used very commonly in Greek literature in the first century, but it was a word that was used here in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus described what it was like to love your enemies. And the Greek word agape, it really is a different kind of love, and there are 3 ways to describe it. First of all, it is unconditional. It's the kind of love that doesn't depend on the other person's behavior, that doesn't depend on whether or not they will love you in return. It is a love with no strings attached. Secondly, it's willful, meaning it's not a love that comes from the heart so much as it's a love that comes from the will. It's not a love of emotion or feeling. It's the love of choice. And thirdly, it's sacrificial, meaning it will cost you something. And this kind of love is very rare. In fact, I would say that most of the love that we see displayed in our world today, in our culture today, I would put it in the category of because of love. I love you because of something. I love you because of your beauty. I love you because of what we have in common. I love you because you love me in return. I love you because you are my family and I'm expected to. It's a because of kind of love. Agape love, on the other hand, is a very different kind of love. It's what I would call an in spite of love. I will love you in spite of how I feel. I will love you, I will choose to, in spite of what you have done. I will love you in spite of what it may cost me. That's agape love. It's a love that chooses to act in the absence of emotion, or sometimes in spite of emotion. Because loving your enemies doesn't mean that you like them. Doesn't mean that you have a pleasant feeling toward them. Doesn't mean that you agree with them or even tolerate their behavior. It does mean to love your enemies that you will seek to do good and to do something that will bless them. It means this, I'll say it again. Agape love means when someone else does something to you that you don't deserve, you do something for them that they don't deserve. Now, I don't know what that means for you. You bring to mind the person that you thought about a few minutes ago, the person in your life who is the most difficult person to love. What does it mean to do something for them that they don't deserve? Maybe all that it means is that when their name comes up next time, say something nice about them instead of saying, well, if you knew that person the way I know that person, let me tell you what they're really like. Maybe it means doing something tangible and specific as a gift to them or just to bless them. Maybe the enemy in your life is your former spouse. And maybe that person has fallen on hard times financially. What if you were to just write a check and to give them a gift and say, hey, I want to help you. Maybe your enemy right now is the person that you work with who's always competing with you and who got the promotion that you feel like you should have gotten. What if you were to just write a note and say, hey, congratulations on your advancement? Maybe your enemy right now is that person, that obnoxious neighbor who throws loud parties late into the night and keeps you awake. What if you were to just go over and mow their lawn for them at 5:30 in the morning? What does it mean to love your enemy? What specific action can you take to bless that person? Now go back to verse 44. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and then do this, and pray for those who persecute you. Now, not pray about them. Lord, please change that person. Not pray against them, like, Lord, may they meet an untimely death. Pray for them. That person that has hurt you, that person that has wounded you, and you find yourself lying in bed at night, replaying those events over and over in your mind and thinking about what you would say if you had the perfect opportunity. And when you find yourself doing that, you stop and you pray. You pray for them. Maybe at first it's through gritted teeth and clenched fist, but you pray that God would bless them, that He would speak into their heart, that He would save them, and maybe even that He would change them. I think one of the most powerful ways to change your own heart and to heal the hurt is to pray for somebody that's hurt you, because you cannot hate someone and pray for someone at the same time. It is impossible. And here's the interesting thing. Jesus didn't just teach this, He actually lived this, because almost 2,000 years ago, when He was being mocked and beaten and crucified on a Roman cross, one of the last things He did, some of His last spoken words on that cross, were a prayer for His enemies, for the people who were torturing Him in that moment. Jesus said, Father, this is a prayer, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And every time I read this, I think the most fascinating part of this little prayer is the last part, for they do not know what they are doing. In other words, as He's praying, He's looking beyond their actions and seeing their hearts, and He's seeing that there's a blindness and a darkness in their hearts, such that they don't even fully recognize what they are doing in that moment. He looked beyond their actions, and He saw their humanity. And as you pray for those people in your life that have hurt you, I think sometimes that's the way you just need to pray. God, help me to see past their actions and to see their hearts and to see their humanity. Because here's something I've figured out, and you have too probably, that it's hurt people who hurt people. There's usually something behind the actions. I like the way Henry Wadsworth Longfellow put it. He said, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. Craig Groeschel, in his book Confessions of a Pastor, gave an example from his own life of this. Here's what he wrote. He said, one time I was praying during worship a few moments before preaching. Eyes closed, focusing on God, I felt someone slip a note into my hand. I never saw who it was, but the note was marked personal. I thought to myself, someone probably wrote a nice note to encourage me before I preach. A warm, loving feeling settled over me as I unfolded the paper. A moment later, I lost that loving feeling. Evidently, the note was from a woman who had tried to see me on Friday, my day off. She took offense at my absence and blasted me with hateful accusations. This happened literally seconds before I was to stand up to preach. In that moment, I had a choice. I could internalize the offense and become demoralized and discouraged, or I could ask myself, I wonder what she's experiencing that caused her to lash out. I chose compassion over depression. My heart hurt for her. I knew that such a disproportionate reaction must indicate deep pain. So I didn't take her note personally. And then he says this, consider the source and consider the possibility that the jab may have come from an injured heart. Dismiss it and move on. If you don't, you may become the very thing you despise. How should I respond to my enemies? Jesus said, I want you to do this. I want you to love your enemies, and I want you to pray for them. When someone does something to you that you don't deserve, do something for them that they don't deserve. And the question that may now be in the back of your mind is this third question. Why should I respond this way? Why would I ever live this way? This is so counterintuitive. This is so countercultural. Jesus goes on to say this. He says, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that, here's why, you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Now, this does not mean that we can earn our way into God's family or into heaven by loving our enemies. In that culture, when you wanted to describe someone, one way of describing them would be to say that they are the son of something or the daughter of something. For example, Jesus had two disciples, James and John. He had a nickname for them. He called them sons of thunder because of their personalities, which is kind of a cool wrestling tag team duo name, I think, or a punk rock band. Sons of thunder, he called them, because they had characteristics, impulsivity of thunder. So in that culture, if you were to say this person is a son of God or a daughter of God, you would say that they bear the characteristics of God himself. And Jesus is saying this. He's saying when you love your enemies, there's going to be a family resemblance. You're going to be seen as, you're going to be known as sons of your Father in heaven, daughters of your Father in heaven. And here's why. Because he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, the heart of God is such that God doesn't reserve his love and his blessings only for people who acknowledge him and worship him and love him. That God is good even to people who reject him. There are people who got a sunrise this morning who didn't deserve a sunrise. There are people who've rejected any idea of God and don't believe in him at all. They want nothing to do with him, but they breathe the air he provides. And they eat food that grows because of the creation that he has made. God does not restrict his love only to those who love him. He loves everyone, including his enemies. And the best example of that, we'll talk about that in a minute, is the cross. The cross is the greatest example of God loving people who wanted nothing to do with him, who had even wounded him by their rebellion. So Jesus says, when you live this way, you take on a resemblance, a family resemblance. And then he goes on to this, and this is just so convicting. This just really gets in your business. He says, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? In other words, what's the big deal about that? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? In other words, if all you do is love the people who love you back, big deal. Even the mafia does that. Even gang members do that. You know, the worst people in society know how to love people who love them back. There is nothing unique about that. There is nothing special about that. But when you love your enemies, that takes not just effort, that takes supernatural effort. I've heard it said this way: when you love people who are like you, that's ordinary. When you love people who are unlike you, that's extraordinary. But when you love people who dislike you, that's revolutionary. And see, the kind of love that we're talking about today is not ordinary love, not the ordinary love where you love someone because you know they're going to love you back, where you love someone because they're easy to love, they're very lovable type people. No, we're not talking about ordinary love, we're talking about revolutionary love. Because we are called as followers of Christ not to be ordinary, but to be part of a revolution. which means that we're going to live and we're going to act and we're going to respond in ways that are revolutionary in terms of the culture that we live in. And when we interact with other people, they should sense something different in us. They should sense something in us that is profound, something that is beautifully countercultural, something that is attractive in the way that we love even those people who are hard to love and don't always respond to our love. And you might be thinking, well, Mark, I get what Jesus was saying. I understand what you're saying as you unpack it. But if we could sit down and talk, if I could tell you my sad story, if I could tell you what happened to me, you would certainly give me a pass. And you would tell me, obviously, no human being could ever do what Jesus is saying. And if you struggle to find the strength to love your enemies, let me tell you the cure for that. Let me tell you what you do. You just go back to the cross. Because at the cross, all of us who were enemies were shown love. Here's the way it says it in the Bible in Colossians chapter 1. It says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. See, the message of Christianity, the message of the gospel, is that God loved us when we were still his enemies. And by his love, we get to be transformed from enemies into adopted sons and daughters. And so the whole motivation behind living this way is we just get to pour out what's been poured into us. We just get to allow others to experience what we ourselves have experienced through God himself. It'd be kind of like this. Imagine after church today, you go out to Wendy's for lunch, and I happen to be standing right behind you at the counter. And you go to pay for your meal, and you realize that you don't have quite enough cash and don't have a credit card, and you're $1 short. So I reach into my pocket, I pull out $1, and I hand it to the cashier. And you say, thank you. And I say, hey, no problem. Glad I could help out. And then a few days from now, I happen to win the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. Like they show up at my door, and they give me $2 million. And later on that day, Wednesday, I see you, and I say, man, you're not going to believe this. I am not making this up. Publishers Clearinghouse, they showed up at my door today. Big cardboard check, balloons, TV cameras, the whole thing. I won $2 million. By the way, do you have that buck that you owe me from Sunday? Like, wouldn't that seem ridiculous? And I wonder sometimes if it doesn't seem ridiculous in the eyes of God when he has so richly poured out his love on us, his grace on us, his forgiveness on us, that we are not willing to share even a fraction of that with the people around us who hurt us. And if you ever struggle to love your enemies, go back to a blood-stained cross and remember that when we were enemies of God because of our own choices, he showed us his love, and he went to the greatest extent he could go to love us, to turn us from enemies into his adopted sons and daughters. And so all we have to do is live up to that same thing that we have experienced. There was a beautiful picture of what Jesus was teaching here. It played out here in the state of Pennsylvania about 12 years ago, just outside of Lancaster. On a Monday morning in October, a gunman walked into an Amish schoolhouse and opened fire. He killed 5 little girls and wounded 5 more, and then turned the gun on himself, and he took his own life. In the aftermath of that shooting, there were no lawsuits, there were no rallies, there were no demands for public officials to do something. But do you know what there was? There was grace, and there was forgiveness. The gunman was a 32-year-old man by the name of Charles Roberts, a very troubled man. He lived right there in the community. He knew these families. And his parents also lived right there in the community. And when they heard what their son had done, Chuck and Terry Roberts were devastated at what their son had done. And they thought they could never face their neighbors again. They would have to move. They would be blamed for his actions, like that they as parents should have somehow seen this coming. And they were devastated on so many different levels. But within hours of the shooting, there was a knock at their front door. It was a man by the name of Henry. He had come as a representative of the Amish community. And he said to them, he said, Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, we love you. This is not your fault. We believe that the devil got a hold of your son's heart. and we do not hold you responsible, nor even him. We are a forgiving people. And he spent an hour with them, just talking with them and trying to help them understand that they were forgiven. And those weren't just words for the Amish people, because eventually Chuck and Terry Roberts, they had to bury their son, the gunman. And so on the day of his burial at the cemetery, 30 Amish men and women showed up, and they formed a wall, a blockade, so that the media cameras couldn't interrupt the service. Some of the people in that line were the parents of the girls who had died in that schoolhouse. And at the end of that burial, they went up to Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, and they extended their condolences on the loss of their son. This is a picture of Terry Roberts. It was taken a few years ago when she did a newspaper interview on the 10th anniversary of the shooting. She's holding a picture of her son, Charles, and the word over that door, over that window, is the word forgiven, because she's experienced it. In fact, just prior to when this picture was taken, she had to be hospitalized for a period of time. She was battling stage 4 cancer. And while she was in the hospital, a young Amish woman came and cleaned her home before she came back home. That young woman, now in her late teens, was one of the victims of that shooting who'd recovered. Came and cleaned the home of the mother of the man who shot her. That Christmas, after she was home from her cancer treatments, a group of Amish kids came to her home, about 25 of them, and sang Christmas carols to her. She struggled deeply to forgive her own son. She was so broken by what he had done and so angry at him. And eventually, because of the example of her neighbor, she was able to forgive her son. And here's what she said. She said, "Forgiveness is a choice. Forgiveness isn't a feeling. These sweet parents were as grief-stricken as I was, their hearts broken like mine. I did not have to stop feeling anger, hurt, and utter bewilderment at the horrific decisions Charlie had made. I only had to make a choice to forgive." And that's all Jesus is calling us to make a choice. It's not an easy choice. It can be a heart-wrenching choice, but it's a choice nonetheless, a choice to love your enemies and to pray for them. We're going to close with one more song, a song that just reminds us in a very powerful way of how all of us at one time were enemies toward God because of our own choices, but then by his love, he opened the door for us to become his adopted sons and daughters. As the band comes to set up, just watch this with me.